Greater Than 0% is a 501c3 nonprofit that's on a mission to share stories of organizations from around the world that are changing lives. We have weekly episodes featuring amazing nonprofits and monthly episodes interviewing top business executives. You can find us at gtzp.org on your preferred streaming or social media platforms.
Alrighty, so thanks everybody for tuning into this episode. Today we have Elisa Stampf, who is the CEO and co-founder of Insure Equality. Elisa, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
All right, thank you. Well, we always start by the mission of the organizations we're interviewing. So what is the mission of Insure Equality?
The mission of Insure Equality is to uplift the voices in our industry that are typically excluded or minimized. And when I say our industry, I mean insurance right now, but I'm sure we'll get into it. We're hoping to expand that conversation.
All right, so we'll get into the programming, but before we do, why you?
I saw this question when we were prepping for it, and I have to laugh because initially I never wanted it to be me. I think I come off as an extrovert to some people, but I need my introvert time. I need my safe space. I want to hide sometimes. I need to recharge after social interaction. And I actually remember partway through my insurance career, because I've spent over a decade in the industry, sitting at a desk going, man, I wish someone would do something. I would be happy to help, but I don't want to be that person. And so it's so funny that you say, why you? Because even up until the beginning of this year, I was really still struggling with the fact that it was me. Really where it started was in 2020. And I don't think I have to tell anybody why 2020 made us rethink all of our decisions in life and that introspection that occurred. I was on the carrier side of the industry. And if you don't know the industry very well, there's the carrier side. So think like the Progressives, the Geicos, the commercials that you see. And then there's the agents. And I was on the carrier side for the longest time. And in 2020, I moved to the agency side because I wanted to be a part of my community. I was watching small businesses close left and right. I didn't want to be in the ivory tower, as they say. I wanted to actually affect change in my community. And as a queer woman, it's not often that you find that in leadership. And so I wanted to do it. I wanted to hold the door open. And within a few months, I was already being harassed and forced out.
Jeez.
And I don't use that word lightly. I know that there's a lot of talk about it. I went through the Me Too movement when I was a marketing rep in the industry. I remember having a lot of those conversations. So I understand that people are like, well, yes, but what did you experience? And I'm not going to get into the details of that here because honestly, that doesn't matter. What does matter is that I thought my life was over and I knew my career was over. Because when you have people in power making decisions for people that really don't have to do with their performance, that have everything to do with whether or not they like the person, we all fail.
Yep.
And so what happened was, because it's still the pandemic, right? I'm on a Zoom room with a ton of other women in insurance and intersectional, geographic, race, religion, background, part of the industry. And someone, thank goodness for them, looked straight into that Zoom camera and said, Elisa, what's up? And I think any other day, I probably would not have said what was on my mind. But that day in particular made me go, okay. And so I shared. And I hung my head immediately thinking, I'm going to get blamed for this, or maybe I could have been smarter. Maybe I could have avoided this in some way. But instead, what I was met with was the biggest, most beautiful virtual hug I've ever received. And every single person in that Zoom room went around and told their story. Wow. And their mother's story, and their sister's story, and their coworker's story, and their friend's story. And I'm looking at the room going, statistically, this is everybody. And that's a problem. So honestly, the question, why you? I never wanted it to be me, not because I don't think I can do it. I'm here now, but because I didn't think I was the right voice. I didn't think I was the right person. I was finding so many excuses to say, well, I don't hold every degree of marginalization, so I can't speak to it. But what I'm recognizing through this process and the process of learning me and this industry and what we're doing is that the privilege that I hold helps me have the conversations that I'm able to have. And that has been a huge part of the journey, and knowing that anybody can affect change, because I was the person that didn't think that they could either.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that. That is a very powerful origin story of what seems to be fueling you and fueling Insure Equality. So I feel like the natural next question is that fire that was that has driven you since the inception. I'd love to hear what it has translated to in the early days of Insure Equality and how it's developed and evolved over time. Like, what were some of the initial activities that you wanted to target and influence change?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked, because it has had an evolution. We've only been around for 2 years, but to see where we started to where we are now is a huge whole journey. As I'm sure you know, you talk with founders all the time. But after that moment on the Zoom call, I started picking up the phone and calling every person in the industry that I knew. What have you experienced? What would you change? What would you do to make this industry a little bit different, a little bit better? And in July, I met with some new co-founders. We built a team, we built a board, and we launched a nonprofit in 6 months. And our initial roadmap was 3 things: accountability, community, and transparency. And so that was storytelling, allowing people to share their stories anonymously in a place that made sense. We had a lot of people that took us up on that. And that was incredible and amazing, because every time we shared one, what we consistently got back was, oh my God, I thought that was mine. And that told me we were on the right track. The second thing was allowing people and asking people to sign a pledge to commit to people over profits, essentially. It's a high level, some people call it vague, but really what it's meant to do is include anybody that works in or next to, adjacent to insurance, to say, I care more about the people in my company than I do about the profit that I make by being associated with someone that's causing harm. That's really the basis of it. And the last piece of it was to create this tech product called Phoenix that allows us to understand the culture in an organization. I think in the data-driven world that we live in, we're so hung up on metrics and the yes, no, and the binary, and we've forgotten how to take subjective information and make it real. So if you go to like a Glassdoor or some other sort of rating mechanism, you'll get questions like, do you like the CEO? Or would you recommend this place? And we took it from a different angle. We talked to therapists, we talked to psychologists, and we said, how do we make this make sense off of something that's intangible?
Yeah.
And most of our questions are feel-based questions. So, the pain scale that you see in the hospital?
Yeah.
We incorporate that in over half the survey. So the survey itself won't take you that long, but it's going to give you a mechanism to talk about how you feel and not numbers, because I think that's where we missed the boat on so many of these pieces. So we launched Phoenix last July. We won an award for it in beta, which was incredible. And it's been an amazing journey. We measure culture based off of what we call components of culture. So these are things, think about like accountability, communication, transparency, integrity. That's the number 1 listed value for most companies, although it isn't often felt. And then part of that roadmap was to be able to give people something tangible so that they could take these results and then define that for themselves. Where are we doing well? Where are we missing? And how do we bridge that gap? And so I'm really pleased to say that final piece of the puzzle just launched. We launched the Phoenix Culture Certification just this past month. We collaborated with the University of Chicago and their Board Fellows program and another consultant out of Georgia, the Vivian and Virginia Ventures, V3, to put together this offering. And it's custom-paced, coach-led, and focused on the human experience. So it's 8 to 12 people. It could be a team, it could be the whole org, it could be a mix of folks coming together and putting together a tangible business plan with outcomes through a DEI lens.
Wow. Okay. No. I've been writing down some of my follow-up questions. Going from the first part, storytelling, you said that was one of the 3 initial important activities that you wanted to do, in the first 6 months or in the inception of the organization. Have those been able to be baked into follow-up action items, or is that more so just to create that space where people could share their feedback on their experience within their company. I'm wondering how, or if or how that's translated into actions.
That's a great question. It's a both and. So we're about consent because we know what it's like to not have it. And so for many people, they want their story to live and die in that place. Like, I want to tell it, that's it. But what we're hoping and what we're pushing for as we continue to move forward, because again, we're only 2 years old, so under-resourced, underpaid, but still pushing forward, is to take these pain points that we're seeing, aggregate that data and information, and then start to talk to companies, agencies within the industry to say, these are the pain points that we're hearing and experiencing, and you may not be getting that feedback. And we know it's largely because we either think that they don't trust you or because they've experienced before, and be able to start solving for those. So to give you an example, one of the biggest things that we hear is about the merger and acquisition activity within the insurance industry. That's causing a lot of cultural shifts because you've got large companies eating a lot of smaller ones. And so when you're combining all of these different groups of people, regardless of whether or not they're in the same area, they're probably still going to have cultural differences.
Yep.
So we're trying to think about how to manage that. And we're also trying to think about how do we bring more voices to the stage? So storytelling isn't just about what happened to you on your worst day. It's also, what do you experience in your day to day? How can we start to take these pain points out of the conversation and turn them, to your point, into tangible action? So one of those pieces that we're working on is bringing talent into the agency force. It's very difficult. There's a high degree of a barrier to entry to come in as an agent. You either have to have a ton of money or a ton of social capital, typically both. And so if you're coming in with a degree of marginalization or a degree of underrepresentation, that makes it that much more difficult for you. So we want to be able to partner with companies to remove that barrier, to make it easier for people to come in. It will expand the competitive landscape. It will start to shift the culture totally of the industry, and it will allow more stories to be told, the ones that we want to hear, the positive ones, the ones of winning, of victory, of belonging.
Yeah. Why is that such a barrier of entry? I didn't know that about the industry, that the agent side, you need that. It's almost like a prerequisite to join. Why is it required?
So it's happened slowly over time, because what's wonderful about insurance is that there's not a specific degree to come into it. There are degrees now that you can get in insurance, and that is a newer development.
Right.
That said, you don't have to have a college degree to be in this industry. You really don't even technically have to have a high school diploma or a GED. You can just have a want, a desire, and be really good with people, or not even good with people, and decide that you want to be in this industry. And it is a wealth generating industry. When you're looking at the industry, there's two pathways in. There's the captive insurer side and the independent insurer side. A captive insurer is someone that controls the entire supply chain. So a perfect example of this is State Farm. State Farm owns the entire supply chain. They supply the policy. They work with agents that only sell their policy. So if you go to a State Farm agency, you will only have access to State Farm. Nothing wrong with that. That's one mechanism. The other mechanism is the independent agency side. So if you go to a Joe Smith agency in your town, Joe Smith will have access to anywhere between 5 to 50 different carriers that he can choose from. And the difference in that is opportunity, not just for the customer, but also for the agent. So if you have a book of business that just took a rate increase, I'm sure we're all very accustomed to seeing our insurance rates go up. So say an insurance rate goes up way beyond somebody's comfort level, they can go back to their agent and say, I need something else. He now has other access points that he can go to. If it goes up at State Farm, you don't have that.
Right.
So at a State Farm, it's easier to get in. You don't necessarily have to have a book of business. You don't have to have money, but they own your book.
Right.
And if you aren't able to hit targets, you don't get paid. So we see a lot of people with degree of marginalizations or underrepresentation go through that path rather than the independent side, because to get in on that side, you typically have to buy a book of business or you have to have social capital to get in. And so if you are somebody that is underrepresented, to be able to access that is difficult. And then what we experienced in the pandemic with the high degree of merger and acquisition activity, that meant that all of those buyouts increased. On average, we were seeing like a 10x revenue price point. which means you had to come in with millions of dollars. And now banks are a little stingier, right, with what they will loan you. So getting into that side, more difficult. And so building wealth in this industry, more difficult unless you look a certain way or have access in a specific way. And so I'm really appreciative that you asked that question, because I don't think the vast majority of people
Yeah.
understand how insurance works. And I would say if we have a goal beyond uplifting the voices in our industry that are typically excluded or minimized, it's to make insurance a dinner time conversation.
Yep.
Because the more we talk about it, the more we can make change. And right now, given the difficulty that we have with this concept, we're not going to move the needle. But if we have voices in our community going, hey, that's kind of messed up, I would really like to see that changed, that's when companies can go, oh, we're actually hearing this from our constituents. We're hearing this from our policyholders. We're hearing this from our agency owners. This is something that needs to change.
Okay. Thank you for that explanation. It makes a lot more sense now.
It's so not complicated for something that is very complicated.
Right. People over profit. That is one of the slogans and goals of the organization and of the commitment. So fiduciary responsibility, is that only in the finance industry, or is that something that you also see in the insurance industry? It kind of sounds a little bit like having some sort of formalized fiduciary responsibility to your customers. In this case, if you're an agent, or if you're, State Farm, or if you're independent.
You've done your homework. Yes, there is a responsibility. There's licensing agreements. You have to go through it depending on your state, 1 to 2 years. There's continuing ed that you have to maintain. So absolutely, there is a fiduciary responsibility. And that means that the responsibility is on them to protect your well-being, not just that you're covered correctly, but that you're covered at a fair and reasonable price, which we also don't see that often. So that is a piece that we're tackling and grappling with right now, because what you'll see is in our actuarial tables, while we say we don't redline, and for those who don't know what redlining is, that is taking a line, it literally was a red marker back in the day, and saying we don't want to insure this neighborhood, or we don't want to bank with this neighborhood. And while we don't do that in practice, what typically happens is we've built actuarial tables where we say we don't have the data for this, so it automatically raises the price. And so we're working with community organizations and with leaders to say, okay, so we understand that maybe you don't have the data here. How do we get it? Because if that is the barrier to you giving fair and reasonable prices to this neighborhood, then let's remove it. Because it's impacting people in ways that is preventing, again, wealth generation, home ownership, job security at all.
What are some of the data points that aren't available for those areas or neighborhoods or communities or cities that kind of get the automatic price increase when you're submitting for insurance?
I'd say it's more about what we have or what we lean on than what we don't have. But if we're talking about specifically what they don't have, it's interesting because it's kind of a catch-22, and it's a little bit of chicken and egg, because they don't have the data because they're not there. So I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is that we tend to lean on mechanisms that are inherently either racist or homophobic or sexist. So credit score is a great example. Typically, if you're looking at personal insurance, credit score is a mechanism for determining your price point. Which communities typically see worse credit scores? The Black and brown communities, immigrant communities, people that aren't typically white, privileged, rich. And so there are certain states that prohibit the use of credit scoring when using rating, but most still use it. So when we're thinking about data points that they need, we also have to be talking about the other side of that conversation. What don't we need to make this determination? Because just because you have X credit score doesn't mean that you're not going to pay your insurance, but it is excluding people from that conversation, and certainly from being insured at a reasonable price. Yeah.
So I feel like you mentioned the chicken and the egg. I feel like again, and this is a business perspective, and it's hard to have that people over profit. You have to have that lens. But how do you provide fair insurance quotes when there's some data points that you're used to getting and you're unable to access those data points? So how do you figure out a way where, as a business, you're trying to minimize the risk of doing something so you can stay in business, right? Because if you do the financial crisis that we had recently, if you give out too many loans with an expectation that so you're familiar with it. So like, how do you balance risk with equal opportunity, right?
Yeah,
That is such a tough question. Yeah,
it is, but I think the nature of the question is one that we're asking, and I think that's where we really need to be investigating ourselves. Because instead of assuming that people over profit means that it's less profit overall, we need to consider the fact that we're missing out on opportunity, that by honoring humanity and honoring certain groups of people, we're actually all benefiting. Because not only is everybody getting a lower rate, but we're also insuring more individuals. There's a couple community organizations that I'm looking at that are doing some really cool work. And you'll forgive me, I'm blanking on the name, but maybe I'll get them to you after this.
Yeah.
With neighborhoods to actually close that coverage gap. And we're starting to see this broaden because of environmental issues, insurers backing out of certain things. But I think inherently that's the miss, is that we assume that honoring a person and their identity means that it's less profitable for us. We use that tagline a lot, and it's important to recognize that it doesn't necessarily preclude you from making money. Now, that being said, when we're thinking about people over profit and how do we balance the business decision, part of that is making sure as many voices, especially the stakeholders in our community that we're trying to access, are actually included in that conversation. Part of that boils down to leadership. So last year there was a congressional hearing held, and they ran through different numbers of diversity within the insurance industry. And the best word I think that they could use for it was disappointing. I know that that's a political word.
Yes.
Disappointing at best. And when you look to leadership, the people that are making the decisions of how we're operating, which communities we're in, how we're setting the prices, they're predominantly white, male, cisgender, heterosexual, and of a certain age bracket.
Right.
If we look at consumer behavior, most decisions, especially purchasing decisions, are made by women in a typical heterosexual household. Right? If they're not being included in that decision, how are we making decisions that make sense? If we're thinking about the Black and brown communities that are predominantly underinsured or not insured because of the price point, are they included in that decision? Have we talked about why? And I think that's really the crux of the issue, is that we've made a lot of assumptions over time using specific data points that made sense to us then. And as we know, the world has changed. And even if it hasn't changed, a lot of the systems that we have in place have been built on inherent bias because of what we assumed, what we knew. We have to remember that the insurance industry is a centuries-old industry. It has roots and activity going back to the transatlantic slave trade. There was actually a John Oliver episode that I remember seeing, and I rushed to write it down because the little box that he had in the corner said ensuring inequality. And I was like, oh my God, I need to find this document. Because there were many cases where the Jewish community, the Black and brown community, were excluded from being insured at all. It was predominantly built to protect property. And who was allowed to own property?
Yep.
Not women, not Black and brown individuals, not individuals that didn't fit a specific demographic. And so when we think back to that, we need to investigate and audit our processes and our decision-making areas, because the industry is old and some of the institutions that we have in this industry have been here since the beginning. Yep. How have we changed the decisions that we make and the paths that we take to honor what is happening now, not how we started?
What are some of the data points that you think should be considered or shouldn't be considered for looking forward 10, 20 years from now at the insurance industry? I'm curious, as your perspective, you've been in it for a while, right? So what does 2 decades from now look like, or hopefully 2 years from now, or even 2 months from now?
That would be lovely. The insurance industry is inherently a late adopter industry, so I think your 20-year time frame is a little bit more on point. That said, I really hope it's the latter. I will say, first and foremost, that I am not the perfect person to have this conversation with. And the reason is because I don't have every degree of marginalization. I think I am a voice that should be considered, and we should be including others in the conversation. So I want to start there, that I do have opinions. I'm happy to share them. And more people need to be in this conversation to have it be as equitable and effective as possible. Yep. That said, I think one of the places that we should start is to remove the binary from how we devote claims. So when a claim happens, and we're not talking about property, because property is whether or not whether, that's how they file these claims. When you look at just about anything else, it is fault or not at fault. And I imagine if you're sitting there listening to this, you can imagine a scenario where something isn't entirely your fault and it's not entirely not your fault. Right. There's some form of contribution. I think the term in legal terms is contributory negligence. And there's other such terms that we can...
Shared responsibility, maybe.
Absolutely. Yeah. So as we're thinking about this, how are we indicating how claims are happening? Because yes, it could be your fault, as in you left the oven on and then a pizza started. But could there have been a faulty mechanism in the stove? And so what we've done in our situation now is we've deemed that it is either your fault or not your fault, and that will determine how much you pay for that claim. That will determine how much your rate goes up next year. And instead, we're not looking at all the factors. Now, a lot of that is because it's probably labor intensive, but let's think about this from a practical application. So assuming that we're coding things fault, not at fault, what is that going to behoove consumer behavior to do? Prove that you aren't the guilty party. Right? And so it becomes a finger pointing. It becomes a way to pull in litigation, the legal side of things, which also, get this, raises insurance costs. Yep. So if there is a way to say, look, this wasn't all your fault, but it wasn't not all your fault. This is approximately how much we can assign. Not only then does it make it a more fair conversation, we can start to pull away the finger pointing, the cancel culture, I guess you could pull in with that as well. I think what people don't realize is that insurance is one of those industries that outside of your basic needs touches everybody. You have to have it. It's a compulsory coverage. And so it really impacts your life far more than you know. And when we think about that fault, not at fault conversation, how does that impact how we act in society? Not just for insurance purposes, but towards each other. On blame, instead of understanding how both people can contribute or play a role, what we're really doing is saying that people are good or bad. And as we know, nothing is truly a binary. So for me, I'm not going to pull out specific data points. I think it has to start with how we handle claims.
Yep. Wow. The future of Insure Equality. What do you hope to see of the organization in the next months, years, decades to come?
So much.
Yes.
So much. As co-founder, my counterpart is our chief technology officer. And so she's the grounded, like boots on the ground brakes. I'm the gas balloon in the sky. Let's go. So I can tell you all of the vision piece of it and Kylie was in the background going, let's slow our roll. But if I'm looking ahead, there's a lot that I want to accomplish. I want to be able to pull in an agency incubator program so that we can pull people into the industry and do it in an equitable way that gives them the opportunities that they deserve to be afforded. I want to make sure that people understand insurance in our communities and pull our stakeholders into that conversation. And we just had the privilege of holding our very first summit on September 15th here in Chicago on the South Side that was met with rave reviews, because even though it was for insurance professionals, we talked about topics that people typically don't get to associate in a work conversation. We talked about intersectionality, psychological safety, mental health. We talked about racial issues, transgender issues, and we did it all in an authentic curiosity. We added meditation to the mix, and what we ended up with was people feeling empowered to make change no matter what position they sat in. And so as we look ahead to next year, we're definitely going to do the summit again. I invite you to come. We've already got the dates. It's August 26th and 27th here in Chicago, and we're going to talk about a shift in systems. Last year was a shift in perspective. We held it in an art gallery. This year it's a shift in systems and understanding the systems that are at play, the ones that are visible to us and the ones invisible that impact our lives daily. Very similar to that fault, not at fault conversation. But I think ultimately, when I think about the future of Insure Equality, what I really hope is that people feel empowered to be themselves and to make change no matter who they are. Because I'll take us back to the beginning of the conversation when you said, why you? I never thought it could be me. I never thought I had the ability, the power, the zhuzh, whatever you want to call it, to be able to affect change. Even within my organization, even within my department, I think we've whittled away at people's idea of who they are and what they can be, not just to themselves, but to others. And the way that we define culture at Insure Equality is the collective habit that we practice daily. And when we think about it in the way of a community and a collective, we all contribute or pull away from what that culture is. And so if you're listening, I want you to know that regardless of what you believe, you have the power to make change. And it doesn't have to be bold, loud, CEO style change. You can make change by saying no. You can make change by honoring yourself. You can make change by saying something that no one else will say in a room where it needs to be said. And so we have to get away from it's either all or nothing and understand, again, it's not a binary. It's how you show up every day. It's the little things that you do that matter.
Oh, I want to end it there, but people that are inspired and curious and want to learn more and get engaged, how could they get engaged? Where could they find you? What could they do to help?
So many ways. We're currently recruiting for our board. We're going to close applications on November 3rd, our board and our junior board. So if you are interested in making a change in small ways or large, for a big commitment or a small commitment, please go to our website and you can check out information there. It's insureequality.org. If you want to check out that culture rater that won an award in beta, go to phoenixrise.org. It is a separate website because we want to protect that. And engage with us, please. Go to our social media. LinkedIn and Instagram are our two biggest ones. You can find us at Insure Equality. And we're always posting, having monthly events with speakers talking about topics that matter to folks, like religious identity in the workplace and a mother's panel that we hosted earlier this year. So you can engage in 1,000 ways, but if you want to be more involved, go to our website, become a part of the team in whatever way you see fit, and let's make some change.
Oh, well, listen, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it and really inspiring work that you're doing. So people that are listening, follow up. We'll share all the links in the show notes as well. And if this is inspiring to you, which it is to me, get engaged and figure out a way to support your local community in this amazing work that you guys are doing with Insure Equality.
Thanks so much, Joe. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Greater Than 0%. To find more episodes or to have your organization featured on the podcast, you can find us at gtzp.org on your preferred streaming or social media platforms. Find your cause with Greater Than 0%.